Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τον Βαγγέλη τον Πισέ για την παρέμβασή του. Και τώρα νομίζω ότι έχει έρθει πια η ώρα να ακούσουμε τον κύριο μιλητή μας για απόψε, που είναι ο καθηγητής Andrew Dobson, ο οποίος θα μας μιλήσει για το βιβλίο του «Η Πράσινη Πολιτική Σκέψη». Andrew, σε ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που είσαι εδώ στην Ελλάδα και μας έκανες έτσι τη χαρά και την τιμή να είσαι εδώ μαζί μας. Ο λόγος δικός σου.
Thank you very much, Stavros. I want to thank everybody also who has spoken so far, because it's been a really interesting, just sitting here listening to these remarks has been in itself an interesting education for me. And in what I say over the next half an hour or so, I'll try and pick up some of the themes and some of the points, some of the questions that people have been asking, and then we'll have a debate and a discussion. I do first of all, though, want to thank the Green Institute for inviting me to Athens, particularly to Stavros, who has put in an enormous amount of work enabling me to get here, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know him and his colleagues as well in the Institute. Obviously, I want to thank the translators, Spiros. I want to thank Anna as well, obviously, for the incredible work that they've done. I've never had a chance to thank the translators of my work before now, and it's an enormous pleasure at last to be able to do so. Of course, I don't know if it's a good translation. I'm sure it is a very good translation, but nevertheless, I have to thank them for the work that they've done. Also, it's a very handsome cover, I think. So I think Poppy, who designed this cover, also deserves a word of thanks, because I think it's a very striking cover indeed. As I say, great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful, Vangelis, to be here as well. I found your comments really, really interesting. Also, it leads me to want to say that this book itself is not a manifesto. I want to say something to begin with about the background to this book, to try to situate it where it came from, and I think that may help explain why it is what it is, and why it may not satisfy everybody's desires in respect of prompting thoughts and questions around green political thought, perhaps particularly in respect of how to make it practical. But I do think that's very important. As Stavros kindly said earlier, besides being an academic in a university, I'm also an activist. So I'm interested, very interested, in how these ideas can be translated not only into Greek, but also into action. And that's a crucial thing for us to talk about, I think. So say something first of all about the background to the book. In fact, this translation here is a translation of the 4th edition of the book. The first edition was published in 1990, which is an awfully long time ago. I first started thinking about the book, therefore, nearly 25 years ago, which I can't even believe myself, but it's true. At the time, the mid-1980s, the late 1980s, besides looking for work in universities, I was also an activist in the anti-nuclear movement. So I was aware of the debates that were going on around the time, around the idea of the nuclear winter. You may remember the ideas around the nuclear winter. If there were to be a nuclear war, we'd have a nuclear winter. Things would not get hot, as we believe they are now. They would get very cold. So you see how things change over 25 or 30 years. I was aware, as I was being an activist in that movement, and also teaching political theory to students at the same time. One of the things that I was teaching students at the same time was a course on political ideologies, as we call it. And this word ideology clearly is very important. Our understanding on those courses is a very simple, very traditional one. We used to teach our students, and they all end in ism, these words, of course. So socialism, we would teach them anarchism, we would teach them fascism, we would teach them conservatism. And at those times, in those days, there were textbooks that we used to give the students. And the textbooks had a list of chapters at the beginning. In those days, the last chapter in the book was feminism. I wonder why. It was the last chapter in the book. It was the latest ideology to be developed and to be written about in a textbook. Of course, it had been around for a long time, but it had only just become a chapter in the textbooks. Around the late 1980s and 90s and early 1990s, I began to be aware, in a growing sense, that there was another ideology developing, but which hadn't been described and which certainly didn't appear in university textbooks. The ideology I ended up calling in this book ecologism. And now, if you look at these textbooks, it's interesting. If you look at these textbooks now, the last chapter in these books is now not feminism, but ecologism. So it's there now. It's been domesticated, if you like. It's now part of university courses, this ideology called ecologism. So my understanding of ideology then is really quite simple. The way I describe it to the students is that ideologies, whichever one it is, have a very important descriptive or explanatory function. They try to explain the political world. We all know the political world is incredibly complicated. We need ways of making it relatively simple. And what ideologies do is enable us to interpret the political world in particular ways depending upon the ideology. So the same event will be understood differently depending upon the ideological position that you adopt. And I think this is as true of ecologism as it is of any of the other ideologies. So that's one thing that an ideology needs to do. It needs to explain the world to us and to provide us with a way of understanding it relatively simply. This is called the functional definition of ideology. The second function it has is to motivate us to political action. And they often do this by painting a picture of a future for us. So the socialist future will look different to the future for a fascist. The anarchist future will look different to the future for the conservative. And ecologists, political ecologists, do the same. As Vangelis said earlier, there is a picture being painted here of a future. How different is it to the present one? Well, that's something we can debate. But that's my understanding of an ideology then, in that sense, completely functional, an academic understanding of what ideologies are and what they do. And this book then was written to try to describe this, as I saw it 25 years ago, this developing ideology of ecologism. So that's the background to it. Now, of course, when you look at these textbooks and you look at these different chapters, you're looking at the way in which ideologies distinguish themselves, make themselves different one from another ideology. So effectively what these chapters do, and what ideologies generally try to do, is to say, these are the beliefs we have that no other ideology has. This is our centre of gravity. This is what we hold to. This is what we can't give up because it's at the centre of our beliefs. So the socialist might say equality is at the heart of that ideology. That's not to say that other ideologies don't say something about equality, but it's the non-negotiable heart of socialism, you might say. Liberals might say it's freedom. So in this book here, I was looking for what is it in this ideology that lies at its non-negotiable heart? What is it that makes ecologism fundamentally different from these other ideologies that we're much more familiar with? And I very briefly just want to describe three essential features of ecologism that I think make it very different, and still make it very different 25 years on from any of these other ideologies that we're, as I say, probably more familiar with. The first one, I think this word has been mentioned already, is its ecocentric character. Now, this refers to our relationship with the non-human natural world. So what is our proper relationship with nature? Most people have a concern for natural resources nowadays, and I think that's one effect, very, very clear effect, that ecologism has had on political debate, is that resource use has become something that all ideologies, all political parties need to talk about. The difference is that those other political parties tend to talk about the natural world in an instrumental fashion. So the reason why it's important, they will say, is because it's important to us. It's our life support system. So we need to preserve the tropical rainforests because they regulate the weather, because they might provide medicines at some point in the future, all sorts of kind of human instrumental reasons for why the non-human natural world is important to us. Ecologists, political ecologists, in my reading of what they say, yeah, well, that's fine, but we think it's important even if it isn't useful to human beings. That would be an ecocentric view. So it would pretty much effectively saying that the non-human natural world has rights to the same degree that human beings have. Now that's a really radical thought. It's a very unusual thought, and it's certainly not a thought that's shared at all by any of the other ideologies in the so-called textbook. That ecocentric view is something quite specific to ecologism. That's one thing that I thought differentiated it, and that was what I was discovering in my readings. When I was reading political manifestos, I was looking at environmental philosophy. That was one thing that really stood out to me. The second thing that stood out to me came from a book published in 1972, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, called Limits to Growth, which has been updated on 2 occasions since, incidentally, as you also may know. The Limits to Growth idea is incredibly simple, but again, absolutely not shared by any other ideology. The Limits to Growth notion is simply, take that finite planet, that's what we've got. That's it. And there's only one of them. And at the moment, we're living lives as if we had 3. And if we all aspired to live like the average American, whoever the average American is, we'd need 5. As far as we know, though, we only have 1. And barring the possibility of some extraordinary technological development that will enable us to discover other planets that we can mine for resources and so on, that's the one we're stuck with. So that's where the Limits to Growth idea very simply comes from. We need to organize our affairs, economic, social, and political, such that they live within the boundaries given to us by that finite planet. That was the message of the Limits to Growth report in 1972. Now again, I don't think there is no other ideology, I don't think, that shares that idea of limits to growth. I'll say in a minute or two now how these other ideologies have responded to that challenge, but none of them, I don't think, have got around to sharing it, because if they did, then they would have to fundamentally change their whole approach to economics, politics, society, and how we organize our daily lives. So that was the second key element, I think, that ecologism makes ecologism different to any other ideology. The third one is, I think, more contingent, if I can say it like that. This is not a characteristic or a feature particular to ecologism, but I think nevertheless it was, and maybe still is, important to it. And this is the idea of decentralization, political decentralization. The arguments that Greens tended to give for decentralization is that if we can reduce the distance, literally, between production and consumption, then we'll live more sustainably. Trade is fine, but it's, according to this particular point of view, trading across vast distances in the way in which we do is in the long term an unsustainable thing to do. So decentralization, although not specific to green ideology, had a green reason for it, or there was a green or environmental reason given for it, which is that attempt to reduce the space between production and consumption. And in doing so, the view is, or was, that we will live more sustainably. So those then, for me, were the 3, certainly the first 2 anyway, were the 2 building blocks, the 2 key core ideas of ecologism that distinguished it, and I think distinguishes it still from these other ideologies. And that's why I wrote this book, to try to explain that, or those three distinctive features of ecologism, and then to say something about potential for transition from where we are now, or where we were then, 25 years ago, living unsustainably to living sustainably. And I talk about the parliamentary road, if I can put it like that, the parliamentary road to ecologism, or whether the parliamentary road through political parties and so on is unrealistic, and that really it's more about social movements outside of Parliament trying to move this transition. So I talk a bit about transition in there too, and we can talk about that if we wish. What I want to do now, though, is to say a little bit about what happened, I think, in the 1990s, broadly speaking, in the early 2000s, what happened to those 3 ideas. Because I think that the challenge was presented in this ideology, and people reacted to it. And the reactions were very interesting. And let me just go through them one by one. We go through, first of all, the ecocentric argument. Now, what happened, I think, was that, when I first started writing this book, the green representation in parliaments was very, very thin on the ground. There were very, very few green parliamentarians anywhere in the world and anywhere in Europe. Because what happens then is that, and this is the practical question, is that you take these ideas out onto the street, you try to convince people that they're good ideas, and you hope people will vote for you. Well, I think what happened with the ecocentric idea was that it didn't work. People just couldn't take on board the idea that the non-human natural world had a similar moral or ethical status to human beings. That just didn't make sense to people. It was very hard to stand on someone's doorstep to try to get them to vote for you on that basis. So I think from a practical political point of view, that ecocentric idea found itself difficult to survive. So what we ended up with was a more anthropocentric version of green thinking. The idea that we depend upon the non-human natural world, therefore we must look after it, was a very potent thought, and that was a much more practical message to take onto the doorstep and to try to get people's votes. We must look after the non-human natural world because it's to our advantage to do so. It's our life support system. That's a powerful message. So I think the ecocentric idea turned into a more kind of form of, can I call it, enlightened anthropocentrism. That's, I think, what happened. And I think that's probably much still where we are. The limits to growth idea, that was fascinating, I think, what happened in the subsequent years. Because the limits to growth idea was taken on board to the extent that people said, yes, we do appear to have a resource problem. We do indeed only have one planet. We really can't see any more. So what are we going to do about this challenge, the limits to growth challenge? And I think what happened was that people began to develop an idea around, it was called, I think, in Germany and in the Netherlands, it was called ecological modernization. Ecological modernization. And I think Van Gellis referred to this earlier in a different kind of form. This is called, I guess it's called smart growth or green growth or something of that sort. The idea is that we can reduce our impact on the environment by being smarter with our forms of technology, by our forms of production and consumption, mostly through technology. So we can make gains, we can decouple economic growth from environmental degradation by being smarter with the way with which we produce and consume things. Now this was brilliant, because this meant that we could, as we say in English, we could have our cake and eat it. In other words, we could both protect the environment and continue to grow. Fantastic. That's exactly what we want, is it not? So this message, this ecological modernization message, was an extremely powerful response to the limits to growth idea, taken up by governments, by business, and I think still is promoted by governments and business. That's an incredibly potent idea. So that meant that the limits to growth argument that was at the heart of this ideology seemed to be in difficulty because there was a legitimate and perhaps persuasive response to it. The third element was the decentralization. And it was interesting to see academics like myself in other parts of the world who adopted an ecologistic position early on began to move towards the idea of a green state. So now this was not really about decentralization anymore. The view was that we're going to continue to need the state. We can't decentralize, we can't localize to the degree that we'd like to for all sorts of different reasons. What we need to do is to build a green state. And all sorts of ideas about what a green state might be. Often the debates revolved around the Constitution. So we embed green principles in the Constitution of the state in such a way that they become part of our daily political, social and economic life. So lots of debates about the green state meant that the relocalization, the decentralization element of ecologism seemed also to have been dealt with by mainstream politics. This is all a response to the mainstream, to the challenge of ecologism. I think that more or less accurately describes what was going on in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And I must say that when it came to writing the fourth edition of this book, I was beginning to think to myself, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore because the ideology is now changing. It's evolving, to use the word that Van Gellis used earlier. It's evolving to the point now where the three fundamental kind of pillars of ecologism, as I discovered them or identified them in the early 1990s, have now disappeared. So what is this ideology now? Does it even still exist in the way in which I've described it in this book? Well, maybe, I was beginning to think maybe not. But actually, I think there's been some really fascinating recent developments which seem to me to be bringing, actually, these principles back into play, in fact, in quite a dramatic way. The one exception, and I'll just get rid of this very quickly, the one exception is ecocentrism. That really seems to have died a death, really. It's very, very, very few people outside of the group of professional environmental philosophers talk very much about ecocentrism now. So whereas it used to be at the heart, for me, at the heart of ecologism as an ideology, I think now very, very few people talk about it. But the two other elements I think have come back. The decentralization idea seems to have come back. I was talking with Stavros last night about this, asking about whether there's the idea of the transition movement in Greece or not. And I think that you have heard about it, but I'm not sure that it's got any social form to the degree that it has in Britain, France and Canada, for example. Transition towns have been set up, quite a number, hundreds across Canada, Britain, France and other countries. Transition towns have been set up in which a group of people get together anticipating a life of lower energy, lower resource use, a steady state economy, society and politics. And they try to live their lives in that way. This is a relocalized, definitely a localized form of politics which responds very closely or corresponds very closely to the localization or the decentralization that I was talking about at the heart of this ideology 25 years ago. That to me is really, that phenomenon of the transition town movement is definitely worth studying, I think, definitely worth examining, and definitely worth emulating, copying perhaps, to see what it can do in the sense of anticipating what life in 40 or 50 years' time might have to be like, given the next thing I'm going to talk about. So I think that decentralization has come back in. And but the key one, I think, is the limits to growth idea. There has, to my mind, been an absolutely incontrovertible resurgence in recent times of the idea of limits to growth, but not in quite those terms. I think the key moments were when people started to talk about peak oil. I'm not sure how this is translated in Greek, but I'm sure that you know what this is. Peak oil is the moment where more than half of the reserves at our disposal have been extracted from the earth, where we have less than half left. So we've reached the peak of production. There's a debate about when that peak occurs. Maybe it's already occurred, some people will say. Maybe it's occurring now. Maybe it'll occur in 5 or 10 years' time. Maybe it'll be put off a bit by the capacity for extracting oil from ever more difficult sources, reserves, tar sands in Canada, for example. The Arctic, for goodness sake. There's a profound irony. The Arctic ice is melting. Why? Because of climate change. What does that enable us to do? Get more oil out of the ground. What's that oil burning going to do? Reduce the ice cover even more. It's an extraordinary circumstance, this. But nevertheless, at some point or another, this oil will run out. So the idea of peak oil is there. Then people began to talk about peak everything. It's the title of a book, Peak Everything. So this whole idea of the kind of the finitude of resources, that one planet notion, I think has come back into our discourse and into our practice in a really interesting way. People don't talk about limits to growth, I think, anymore. They talk about degrowth. They talk about, this is a book by Serge Latouche, French activist, theorist, called Farewell to Growth. Very powerful movement in France now, the degrowth movement. I think people refer to it as a-growth, the Greek a, without growth as well. People refer to it in those terms as well. But this whole idea, I think, of degrowth has absolutely brought this notion back into the idea of limits to growth back into play in a really important way. We've become re-aware, we've become re-educated about the notion of planetary boundaries, that there are all sorts of aspects of that life support system which are under threat because of our activities of production, consumption, and so on. Above all, maybe, people are beginning to realize, not only in their own lives, but also through academic study, that growth is not delivering what it's supposed to deliver. What is an economy for? What is growth for? It's for human welfare. It's to make us feel happy, presumably, in the broadest sense of the term. But what a lot of academic research seems to be suggesting is that that's exactly what it doesn't produce. More growth does not make us happier. We've grown enormously since the Second World War, given one or two dips, and we're in one now, of course. But we've grown enormously since the Second World War. But if you look at people's responses to whether they're any happier or not, that's a flat line. People are no happier now than they were in 1945. So there's a decoupling then, a clear decoupling of growth and happiness. So we need to organise our lives. Evidently, that's not the answer. The answer is not to grow. So that's another aspect of this debate, which I think, another aspect which has brought the growth question back into our vision, back into our discourse and our consciousness, and back into our practice. There's other important work being done by ecological economists recently also, which talks about that decoupling idea. I mentioned earlier that the ecological modernisation response to limits to growth is that we can decouple environmental degradation from economic growth. But now we're a bit more sophisticated about this, and we distinguish between relative decoupling and absolute decoupling. So relative decoupling is possible. We can indeed produce more growth with fewer resources. We can indeed produce the same unit of production with fewer emissions. So there's a relative decoupling, but at the same time, what we note is that emissions continue to rise. So however smart we are, however clever we are, however technologically advanced we are in terms of our efficiency gains, emissions rise nevertheless. Environmental degradation increases nevertheless. Biodiversity reduction increases nevertheless. It seems as though absolute decoupling is either extremely difficult or even some people would say literally impossible. So if that's true, if absolute decoupling is true, then once again the limits to growth argument comes back into play in a really quite significant way. The final way in which it's come back into play, and I came across a very interesting quotation the other day from Henry Wallich of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States of America. He said, this is a quote from the banker, he says, "Growth is a substitute for equality of income." Growth is a substitute for equality of income. The idea is that a rising tide floats all boats. That's what people say. A rising tide floats all boats. What this forgets is that some people don't have a boat and some people can't even swim. So the idea that a rising tide floats all boats is fine if you've got a boat, but the majority of the population in the world either don't have a boat or don't know how to swim. So this idea that growth is good because everyone in the end will benefit also is clearly, under present circumstances in particular, being brought into question. So for all of these reasons, I think that the limits to growth idea is experiencing a very interesting revival and making ecologism relevant again in a way in which perhaps in the 1990s and early 2000s perhaps it wasn't. Now, let me just say one more thing, if I may. Have I got time, Stavros? Is that all right?
Another 5-10 minutes?
No, I won't go that long, I promise. I won't go that long. Literally, just very quickly, because I must admit, I'm going to be completely clear about this now. I was extremely apprehensive coming to Athens, to Greece, now to talk about ecologism. Why? It's obvious. Because environmental politics in general, ecologism in particular, is generally regarded by most people as being a luxury item. You worry about the environment once you've dealt with everything else. Once people have a job, once people have a home over there, a roof over their heads, once people have got food on their table, that's when you start worrying about environmental problems. That's when ecologism may have something to say to us. But before that, we're not interested, because it's these other things that are more important. If that's true, you can understand why I'm especially apprehensive coming to Greece now to talk about this book and the ideas that there are in it. Because you, in Greece, are suffering levels of unemployment, degradation of all sorts, which are, I mean, to me, almost literally unimaginable, I have to say. I mean, we complain in Britain about austerity and so on, but we haven't got the faintest idea, I don't think, what it's like, actually. I mean, my wife is from Spain. I know a little bit about what it's like in Spain and Portugal. It's pretty bad there. From what I understand, it's even worse here. So my apprehension is clear. I'm apprehensive because these ideas appear to be pretty much irrelevant to the situation that Greece is presently undergoing. I suppose what makes me, I don't really feel any less uncomfortable in a way, but there's a title of a book here by a Greek actually, called Kostas Panayotakis, called Remaking Scarcity. And this idea of remaking scarcity, I think, is really interesting. Clearly, in Greece at the moment, scarcity is like a way of life. It's part of what surrounds you on a daily basis. But where's that scarcity come from? That scarcity has been imposed, I think, upon Greece. Has come about through a series of all sorts of different humans with social, political, and economic reasons. And it's being visited upon Greek people in different ways depending upon where in Greek society you find yourself. Scarcity to me, though, is something which is, and to I think any ecologist, any political ecologist, is unavoidable. But it's a different kind of scarcity. The scarcity that ecologists talk about is the scarcity that's represented by that finite planet. That's all there is. That defines scarcity in a way. So these two kinds of scarcity to me are very different. There's one scarcity which is produced by banks in America lending money to people who they know are never going to pay it back, making risky investments in a casino fashion in the international banking system. The results of which mean that Greece suddenly finds itself with 50% unemployment and knowing goodness knows how many billions of pounds to whom exactly. It's difficult to know to whom. But that's a kind of a human-made scarcity, if you like, which comes from somewhere which is completely driven by what? By greed, not here, by greed of bankers, by a particular banking system which can create money out of nowhere, and that money bears absolutely no relation to anything real in the world whatsoever. It's just numbers on a computer, and yet the result are absolutely human, all too human, in daily lives here. That's an unmanaged scarcity. That's a scarcity into which a country finds itself pitched in an unannounced, unplanned way. What I think political ecologists are trying to do is to say, we will eventually be living with scarcity. We will eventually be living with scarcity, but then the point of a Green Party now is to manage that descent into scarcity in a way that both lives within the natural limits of the world in which we live and is fairly distributed. That's the key thing, and is fairly distributed. This will be, from a Green point of view, a more prosperous life. Might seem peculiar to say so. But given that growth appears not to have made us more prosperous in that happy sense, there must be another answer to the question of what can make us prosperous, content. And I think the Green belief is that scarcity is not necessarily at all the enemy of prosperity. A colleague of mine and I think this book has been translated into Greek, Tim Jackson at the University of Surrey, talks about prosperity without growth. Prosperity without growth. That's the challenge. That's what we need to try to achieve. That's the picture we need to try to paint economically, socially, and politically as well. So that's, I think, scarcity. Let's not what is scarcity? Scarcity is the gap between what people want and what is available. That's all it is. It's the gap between what people want and what is available. The problem under capitalism is that what people want is eternally unattainable. It's that shining, glittery thing on the hill that all of us are going to want, are persuaded to want through advertising and all sorts of other techniques. So scarcity is the gap between what people want and what there is available. What we need to change is what people want and what people need, because what's available is pretty much fixed. So we need to change the sense of what people want and what people need. And I think that's fundamentally now the challenge that we have, a particularly difficult challenge to face in the austerity circumstances in which we find ourselves. But there is only going to be one voice, I think, and it's a Green voice, only one voice asking that question. But Greens have been proved right so many times over the past 25 years, and I think they're going to be proved right over this one too. In another 25 years, I think we'll be understanding of scarcity is the gap between what people want and what's available, and we will have redefined what it is that people want and need. So, thank you very much indeed to everybody for inviting me here and listening to me now. Thank you for being so patient, listening to me speaking in English. Apologies for that. I do want to thank also, I meant to do this at the beginning, to thank our interpreters at the back who are doing a fantastic job for us as well. And thank you, above all, to all of you. Thank you.